Husband cheated. Should a way out be given to him? At the banquet, the wives brought up the topic. My answer drew a wave of strange, mocking looks. Mrs. Law, did I hear that right? You're saying no, too? That comment sparked laughter. I smiled as well. After all, everyone knew I was the weakest, most spineless wife in our circle. Later, when they recalled that moment, they were horrified to realize the way out I meant was not the same as the way out they meant. Chapter 1. As I stood to leave, the jeers behind me had yet to cease. She actually dares to say she won't give him a way out? That's absolutely laughable. Exactly. She's an orphan who never even went to college, married into the Law family, and after 5 years, still no sign of a baby, and now she's so deluded as to refuse President Law a way out. Isn't this basically the same as being kicked out? President Law hasn't spared her an ounce of dignity in public. If it weren't for the old man in the Law family caring about appearances, she would have been thrown out long ago. The only reason she's survived this long is by being submissive and lowly, not showing an ounce of temper otherwise. Why would they call her the mud doll? They weren't even the slightest bit afraid that I might overhear. Even though this was a Law family banquet, even though I am the eldest daughter-in-law of the Law family, even though their husbands rely entirely on my husband's favor, yet they still believed their status was a notch above mine. Because it's common knowledge, my husband Calvin doesn't love me. I turned a deaf ear and, as the eldest daughter-in-law of the Law family, smiled politely and graciously at every guest. Today, the groundbreaking ceremony for the new Law pharmaceutical factory drew many longtime clients and partners. Father-in-law Simon Law had already given the order long ago. The most important thing in the Law family is dignity. Whoever causes the Law family to lose face must be dealt with according to family law. Indeed, in the 21st century, the influential Law family in City A has its own strict and well-defined internal system. At that moment, a chorus of warm greetings rang out at the door. My husband Calvin has arrived. With him came his assistant Lisa. Both wore matching white formal attire, each adorned with a boutonniere for the celebration. They walked in shoulder to shoulder, drawing all eyes. They looked like a couple about to walk down the aisle. President Law, Assistant Lisa. Everyone greeted her warmly, their tones eager yet respectful. Assistant Lisa, long time no see. Not far off. The gathered wives all stood up with smiles, waving at her. Lisa was poised and gracious, nodding with a smile. When she reached me, she suddenly stopped and spoke politely. Madam Law, I apologize. President Law was delayed speaking with the city officials. It's my fault as his assistant for not reminding him properly. Thank you for your patience. I shook my head hurriedly and smiled, saying, No, your work is important. You're the ones who've been working hard. Are you hungry? I'll ask someone to bring you something to eat. We've already eaten. No need to trouble you. Lisa politely declined, then remembered something and added, there is one thing. I parked my car in a rush and blocked the exit. I don't trust the servants to drive my car. Could I trouble you to help me move it? She looked at me with a warm smile. Chapter 2. Suddenly, the surroundings fell silent, and people deliberately or inadvertently glanced this way. Under the watchful eyes of those eagerly awaiting a spectacle, I nodded without the slightest temper. Of course. Calvin stood silently to the side the entire time, his expression indifferent, watching coldly. Naturally, he wouldn't say a word. After all, they had known each other longer and were closer than I was. Lisa is 32 this year, 2 years older than Calvin. The two were classmates at the University of London. As an assistant, she was intelligent and capable, mature and steady, wielding decision-making power in the company even higher than the vice president. As a mistress, she was low-key and polite, seducing Calvin into a drunken stupor in bed. A person like her, compared to me, a high school dropout, a brainless trophy wife with no skills. She's on a completely different level. When I returned from parking and handed the keys to Lisa, she was sitting on the sofa, smiling brightly while chatting with mother-in-law. Mother-in-law Margarita was a piano teacher in her youth and always prided herself on her elegance. She oversaw everything inside and outside the house but found it unbearably vulgar and never got involved. Likewise, she found me vulgar for having to step in and handle these matters, and never treated me kindly. Trouble, Madam Law, Lisa said lightly without looking at me. her tone as casual as if she were speaking to a waiter. Calvin sat nearby with his legs crossed, frowning slightly. Why so slow? The female guests are all here, and you're just keeping them waiting. Is that how you treat guests? He had taken over father-in-law's position a year ago and already carried the authority and presence of a superior. I pressed my lips and said softly, I just ran into a guest outside and exchanged a few words. I thought since you were here. My mother-in-law clicked her tongue impatiently and cut me off. Calvin is already exhausted handling company matters outside. Does he really need to personally deal with this trivial issue too? You sure know how to slack off. Small families like ours will never make it to the big leagues. She always gestured wildly when emotional. And at that moment, the red wine in her hand sloshed out, spilling onto her white sheepskin high heels. The servant hurriedly grabbed a towel, ready to wipe it off. She glanced irritably at her shoes, then at me, and said in exasperation, You do it. I bent down, crouching at my mother-in-law's feet, carefully wiping the shoes bit by bit. Calvin remained silent. Lisa gave a half-smile, not far off. There were all kinds of ambiguous glances. Madame-in-law is far too soft-hearted, easily manipulated by her husband's mistress outside, and crushed under this entire family inside. Being a daughter-in-law in a wealthy family is truly no easy task. Exactly. Let her polish shoes if she must. They say the eldest daughter-in-law of the Law family is like a malleable clay figure. And it's certainly no exaggeration. Shoo. Be careful not to let the Law family hear. Last time someone gossiped, the old master of the Law family forced them out of the city. Chapter 3. In the evening, I was in the study organizing the guest gift list when the servant told me that father-in-law Simon wanted me to come downstairs for a family meeting. I put my things into the safe and locked it. When I came downstairs, everyone was already there. Father-in-law sat in the center of the living room sofa, lips pressed thin, his expression stern. On the left sat Calvin and my younger brother-in-law Justin. Justin teaches at a university and is rarely seen during the day. He only comes home at night. When he saw me, his eyes brightened and he smiled at me. Mother-in-law sat on the far right with red eyes, her expression full of grief and anger, as if she had just been crying. Father-in-law gave me a slight nod and said in a calm voice, Daniela, please sit properly. I sat down as instructed. In the tense atmosphere, father-in-law spoke in a low voice. When I first arrived in City A, I didn't even have a place to stay. Now that I've built such a large family and business, what do you think it's all based on? Living with dignity, acting with caution. This is the family tradition of the Law family, a rule I have repeatedly impressed upon each of you. He turned his head and sharply reprimanded mother-in-law. How could you treat Daniela like that in public today? You may have the authority of an elder, but doesn't that make Daniela a laughingstock? How do you expect her to deal with people outside from now on? The father-in-law is unquestionably the head of the family. He rarely loses his temper, but when he does, everyone trembles in fear. At that moment, mother-in-law's usual pride and grace vanished completely, and she whispered, I was just caught up in the moment. I didn't really mean for her to wipe it. How was I supposed to know she would immediately squat down? Nonsense. Father-in-law slammed the table. Back then, I came to City A all alone. If it weren't for Daniela grandfather taking me in and helping me get started, would any of you be where you are today? Everyone who makes a mistake must be punished. And you are no exception. Mother-in-law trembled and began to sob in grievance. The Law family made its start in Chinese herbal health products, and the basement still holds the very first set of Chinese herbal grinding tools. Whenever someone in the family slipped up, they were punished by grinding herbs for hours, their arms aching so badly they couldn't even lift a bowl the next day. Father-in-law insisted this was an education in never forgetting your roots. Calvin leaned back on the sofa and said, Dad, Daniela isn't making a fuss about this either. Mom's getting old and can't handle the stress. Maybe we should just let it go. Father-in-law's face darkened. No way. Mother-in-law whispered tearfully. I'm about to perform piano at the orphanage. How can I play if my hands are sore? I'm doing this event for the company's charity. After all, father-in-law pressed his lips together and fell silent. Let it go, Dad. Justin also spoke up to persuade. I said nothing, staring at my tightly clenched knees. Sure enough, father-in-law changed his tone and spoke slowly. Making an exception is definitely out of the question. Daniela, how about you take this punishment on behalf of your mother-in-law? He gently turned his head to look at me. Chapter 4. Dad. Justin suddenly stood up and said loudly, "How can that be? How can we let sister-in-law take the punishment for this?" Father-in-law sighed heavily. "I have sworn that family rules must never be broken. Calvin has to play golf with a client tomorrow. Justin has experiments to run every day. So only you, the junior, can take over." Daniela, what do you think? I slowly lifted my head. I gave father-in-law a gentle smile and said softly, "That's fine, Dad." Father-in-law nodded with satisfaction. "You're a child who puts my mind at ease. I wasn't wrong about you back then." I was grinding herbs alone in the basement when Justin suddenly appeared at the door, his gaze heavy, holding a bowl of steaming noodles. I smiled at him. "Justin, still not resting?" He said nothing. He set the bowl on the table, lowered his brows, grabbed the handle, and silently pushed it forward. I was momentarily at a loss, stunned and motionless, but he seemed somewhat angry, a shadow of displeasure crossing his handsome face. After a while, he spoke in a suppressed voice. "Are you really made of mud? How can someone have no temper at all and say you're unwilling? Who can truly force you? Justin, you should leave quickly. Dad will be upset if he finds out." I smiled awkwardly and walked over to take back the handle. He refused to let go, still struggling fiercely. I suddenly felt a bit anxious. "You're not helping me. You're hurting me. Don't you remember last time? Because you helped me and Dad found out, I was punished twice as much." By the end of my words, I even let a hint of crying slip through. Justin stopped and said softly, "Sister-in-law, Dad chose you as a daughter-in-law precisely because I was still young, so he let my elder brother marry you. Otherwise. He fixed his gaze on me. My face flushed red, and I hurriedly said, "What nonsense are you talking about? Go quickly, or someone will really find out." He sighed deeply. "Sister-in-law, I heard from the butler that you haven't eaten much today. That bowl of noodles was made by me just now. Please make sure to eat it." With that, he abruptly turned and strode away. Chapter 5. 3 hours later, when I returned to my room, aching all over, I found Calvin lying naked on my bed. We have been sleeping in separate rooms for 2 years. Calvin suffers from erectile dysfunction and requires very strong stimulation to perform. Since that humiliating incident 2 years ago, Calvin hasn't touched me again. At that moment, his chest rose and fell as he gasped, squinting at me. "Come here." I bit my lip and slowly walked to the bedside. "I can't give you acupuncture today. My hands just won't steady the needles." I showed him my trembling hand. If I still have any use to him, it's my acupuncture skills. Years of complications often made it hard for him to control his body, either standing firm or losing consciousness. When he had an episode, acupuncture was the only thing that barely brought him back to normal. As the granddaughter of a traditional Chinese medicine master, having been immersed in it from a young age, my technique was still better than most outsiders. Calvin's face darkened the moment he heard my words. Clearly, he was having another episode now, lying there, looking utterly miserable. It was the former, of all days. It had to be today that stirred up all this trouble. He snapped irritably, his bloodshot eyes fixed on me, his voice rough as he said, "You deal with it." I stood still, murmuring, "The doctor said my brother's medication needs to be renewed." His voice suddenly turned cold and harsh. "Do you have to bring this up right now?" I spoke softly. "I haven't found the time to tell you all day. But the doctor said if we don't renew it today, tomorrow's medicine will run out. You know my brother can't miss his meds." Calvin stared at me for a few seconds, snorted coldly, picked up his phone, and made a brief call with a curt order. "Transfer 300,000 to the hospital." Then he hung up and stared at me. "Take off your clothes and come up on your own." I let out a soft sigh. With trembling hands, I began to undress piece by piece. His gaze grew redder, his chest rising and falling more violently. Ugh. Suddenly, I bent over and vomited violently. I vomited on the bed, splattering onto his legs. Calvin is a person with a cleanliness obsession. He immediately cursed angrily at the mess and rushed into the bathroom. When he came out of the shower, his face was dark enough to send a chill down my spine. I mumbled an apology. "Maybe I ate something bad today. I'll clean up right away." He ignored me and picked up his phone to make a call. I'll come over tonight. Wait for me. Then he started putting on the pajamas that had been tossed aside. He said nothing. I said nothing either. In the heavy silence, Calvin finished dressing in his pajamas and headed out. At the door, he suddenly turned around, his expression dark and mocking. Daniela, I'm curious to see how long you can keep pretending. Chapter 6. Early the next morning, I went to the hospital. Older brother Lucas lay quietly on the hospital bed, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. He was once a teenage prodigy, but on the way to a competition. He was in a car accident. Our parents died tragically, and he was lucky to survive, though he became a vegetable. Later, a new drug from abroad miraculously woke him from his coma. But the medicine was expensive, costing over $1 million every year. But at least there was hope. Grandfather, at an age when he should have been enjoying retirement, was raising me while returning to practice medicine day and night, flying all over the country. He took on the full burden of the expensive medical bills. After the car accident, I couldn't bear the shock and dropped out of school, once feeling that life was hopeless. But grandfather told me in his world-weary voice, the world is inherently complex and diverse. Life shouldn't be defined in only one way. Not going to school doesn't mean you can't educate yourself. Grandfather will live a long life. Accompany Daniela as she grows up. Watch you get married. And wait for Lucas to wake up. Calvin was actually the husband grandfather carefully chose for me. He said he owed a great debt to his father, Simon, and since I married into the law family, the father and son would surely treat me well. 25 years ago, on a snowy night, a starving and freezing middle-aged Simon collapsed at the door of grandfather's clinic. After being revived, he knelt before grandfather, begging for a chance to live. During the 5 years Simon studied traditional Chinese medicine under grandfather, he was diligent and honest, humble and kind, kneeling every day without fail to wash grandfather's feet. At first, grandfather refused, but Simon tearfully said he had sworn that only by doing this could he repay the life-saving grace. Otherwise, he believed he would be struck by lightning from heaven. After completing his studies, Simon bade farewell to grandfather and returned to his hometown in the Northeast, quickly establishing a successful career. During holidays, he always made a point to come to City A and persistently knelt to wash grandfather's feet once more. 8 years ago, he returned to City A with his wife and child. By then grandfather was already president of the city, a traditional Chinese medicine association. With grandfather's backing, Simon invested to establish the Law Pharmaceutical Group. Not long after, Simon came bearing lavish gifts and arranged my marriage to Calvin with grandfather. Yet, in the 3rd year of my marriage, grandfather died of a heart attack in the medicine preparation room. One day, I went to the study to ask Calvin for older brother's medical expenses and accidentally overheard his conversation with Simon. Her grandfather's been dead for ages, so why are we still supporting her and that deadbeat? Calvin, you've forgotten again. Dignity is the most important thing in life. Our mentor has done me a great favor, but Lisa has borne humiliation and hardship for so long. Back then, to let me marry Daniela, she had to hide abroad, heavily pregnant, to give birth to Noah. Now Noah is 5 years old. It's only right to let the grandson acknowledge his roots, isn't it? The Law family's bloodline must be recognized, of course, but nothing should be rushed. Our mentor has treated many patients over the years who are politically powerful and influential. Otherwise, how could your second uncle's entire family's affairs be resolved so smoothly? Dad, you can't always be so soft-hearted. Back then, her grandfather opposed the launch of the new product. If I hadn't taken away his medicine the day he had a heart attack, there wouldn't be a law group today. Simon let out a deep sigh. That day, I watched helplessly as my mentor collapsed to the ground. Struggling, my heart was shattered. Chapter 7. Calvin has been a bit under the weather lately. Every day, I go back and forth between the office and home, bringing him freshly brewed Chinese herbal medicine. Just outside the company building, a little boy suddenly dashed out, bumping into me and causing me to stagger back 2 steps. Nearly falling, he bumped his head on my bag chain and started crying loudly. Lisa walked over with a stern expression and hugged the little boy tightly in her arms. Madam Law, what did my nephew do to upset you so much that you have to take it out on a child? I looked at the little boy. His features were strikingly similar to Calvin's. Your nephew? Lisa revealed a faint, barely perceptible sneer. Yes, my nephew, a poor child. Madam Law, you'd better not bully him. I asked again. In what way is he poor? Lisa sighed. This child, 4 now, cannot be reunited with his biological parents, nor can he return to his own home. Wouldn't you say that's pitiful? I nodded. That really is pitiful. She glanced at me and smiled again. However, his father loves him dearly. To safeguard his rights, he arranged a paternity test early on, a rather thoughtful and far-sighted gesture. I patted the little boy's head and smiled as I said, he looks smart just by the way he carries himself. I brought the medicine to the general manager's office and found second uncle's entire family of 4 there. Unlike my father-in-law, who went into business, second uncle's family took a different route. Over the years, the couple and their 2 sons have all risen to leadership positions of varying degrees in their respective state-owned enterprises. The Law family supports each other, growing stronger together. Voices came from inside. Calvin, your second uncle's entire family fortune has been placed under your name. You must not disappoint us. Second uncle, let me be clear, this money is only under my name because you're afraid of the bad impression it might cause if you invest openly. It's not like I asked you to invest. Calvin's voice was slightly hoarse. He had been sick with a cold for a long time, dragging on without getting better. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Calvin frowned as soon as he saw me. I told you not to send Chinese herbal medicine anymore. I have an important project right now and no time to recover slowly. Did you buy the cephalosporin? His voice was tinged with emotion, and he coughed repeatedly. I placed the Chinese herbal medicine and cephalosporin on the table. Although Chinese herbal medicine acts slowly, at least its side effects are milder. At that moment, Calvin's phone rang, and he walked over to the window to answer it. I turned to greet second uncle and second aunt. They nodded coldly, avoiding my gaze, but the 2 cousins sneered with thinly veiled sarcasm. Sister-in-law, is your husband still not awake? He spends money like water every day, all from the Law family business. Is there really any need to keep him around like that? Honestly, in this situation, we all feel that living is worse than dying. I silently poured water into a cup, walked over to Calvin's side, and handed him the medicine first. He instinctively took it and put it into his mouth. I then handed him the cup of water. He tilted his head back and drank. I said, Calvin, don't drink alcohol tonight after taking cephalosporin. He ignored me, still busy on the phone. I repeated it loudly, my voice rising above his phone call. Calvin, you just took medicine. Remember not to. Enough already. Calvin turned away angrily. Can't you see I'm on the phone? Get out. I shivered and awkwardly walked out. As I reached the door, I heard second aunt laugh out loud. This person has no sense. Truly annoying. Chapter 8. That day, on my way home driving, I unexpectedly got into a car accident. A speeding truck rear-ended me, knocking me unconscious. When I woke up in the hospital, the doctor told me I had been unconscious for 5 days. Drowsily, I took out my phone to call Calvin, suddenly seeing the Law family butler rush in. Madam, you've finally woken up. I've been coming by every now and then these past few days to check on you. At last, you're awake. I smiled weakly. I must have worried everyone. I'm fine. But the butler's expression was extremely grave. I looked at him. What's wrong? Is mother-in-law upset? He paused for a moment. Madam, President Law has passed away. I slowly opened my eyes wide. What did you say? Who passed away? The butler spoke in a low voice. On the very night you had your car accident and fell unconscious, President Law suffered a sudden medical emergency outside. He was rushed to the hospital but was declared dead shortly after resuscitation efforts failed. The house has been in complete chaos these past few days. Madam has fainted from crying several times, and it's only thanks to the old master's strained efforts that the aftermath has been managed. The cremation was just completed this morning. I listened in a daze, my entire body frozen, like a shell emptied of its soul. The butler sighed. Madam, please restrain your grief and accept the change of fate. You mustn't collapse now. The old master asked me to come by every day to see if you had woken up. He said there are many formalities regarding the inheritance that require your prompt signature. I said nothing and slowly sat up. The butler quickly came to support me. The car is waiting downstairs. Please hold on. Sir is very anxious. I gently withdrew my hand. The butler looked at me in confusion. I slowly leaned back against the headboard and spoke softly. If it's so urgent, then let him come see me. Chapter 9. When the butler left, his steps faltered, his face full of shock. The young nurse told me that during the days I was unconscious, besides the butler, only one young man had come to see me a few times. Although he seemed downcast, he still carefully arranged a VIP ward for me and hired a caregiver to look after me. I said nothing. I knew deep down that this young man was the only one in the Law family who showed me any kindness. Justin, MS. Daniela. The young nurse looked at me oddly. Usually, people in your condition are too weak to speak. But you seem like you just woke up from a good sleep. My constitution is different from others, I said. After the nurse left, I took out my phone to check. News of the sudden death of the president of Law Pharmaceuticals was everywhere. The news didn't specify Calvin's exact cause of death, only that he was rushed to the hospital in the middle of the night and died despite emergency treatment. The funeral was held on the third day after I lost consciousness. In the photo, father-in-law looked sorrowful as he took charge, while mother-in-law was supported by others, pale and weak. Right beside me was Lisa. Her eyes were swollen and red, with a white flower pinned in her hair, looking every bit the grieving widow. An hour later, father-in-law Simon walked in with a group of people while I was sitting on the bed drinking millet porridge. Mother-in-law came too. In just a few days, both had grown haggard and aged considerably. After all, it's a heavy blow when the old see the young pass away. They were all dressed very formally, as if attending an important occasion, and just happened to come to the hospital. The mother-in-law glared at me with bloodshot eyes and scolded. You still have the heart to eat here while your own husband is dead? You've been lying in the hospital for 5 days, and now that everything is settled, you finally wake up. You really know how to enjoy life. Calvin marrying a wife like you is truly his bad luck. The father-in-law stood silently nearby, his brows furrowed. The young nurse, feisty by nature, immediately snapped back. This is a hospital. Please keep quiet. Lying in the hospital for 5 days, are these the words of an elder? Your daughter-in-law was in a car accident and unconscious, barely clinging to life and finally waking up. Instead of showing concern as a mother-in-law, you come straight to scold her. If this gets out, it's clearly abuse of the daughter-in-law. Mother-in-law's face turned pale at the accusation, and just as she was about to defend herself, father-in-law interrupted in a stern voice. You go wait outside first. Don't embarrass us here. Mother-in-law shot me a glare and reluctantly left. Father-in-law slowly looked at me, his voice tinged with sorrow. Daniela, you already know about Calvin's affair? I put down my bowl, wiped my mouth with a napkin, then looked up, wearing a pained expression. Yes, I know, father-in-law sighed. Calvin's betrayal was a huge blow. It was my oversight. I was just trying to quickly handle the aftermath and didn't consider your health. At a time like this, with your body and mind shattered, of course you can't leave the hospital. Fortunately, the matter isn't complicated. I've called all the lawyers. You just need to sign a few documents, and we'll wait here. Once you finish signing, we'll head straight to the company meeting. He finished speaking and waved his hand. 2 lawyers in suits stepped forward. One handed over the documents, the other the pen. I glanced at the cover. It read Declaration of Waiver of Inherited Shares. My father-in-law didn't look at me again. He took out his phone and called. Notify the shareholders to convene a meeting. We'll be there in half an hour. He spoke calmly and confidently, as if my signing was such a simple, straightforward matter that wouldn't take much time. I reached out my hand, but he didn't take the document. Instead, he slowly raised his hand, rubbing his temples. The lawyer urged me. Law, madam? I lowered my eyes and said calmly. I don't want to sign this kind of document, and I don't have to. Right? The lawyer was taken aback. Of course. I nodded slowly. Is that so? Then I won't sign. My father-in-law, who was on the phone, suddenly turned his head. He looked at me in disbelief. Chapter 10. I seemed unaware of his gaze and kept rubbing my temples slowly. My father-in-law remained silent for a long moment. I knew he was carefully weighing his options. In the ward, it felt as if some unresolved tension was slowly solidifying. Sure enough, when she spoke again, her tone had shifted. Daniela. Calvin. With him gone, you truly have lost your main support. By the way, I've been thinking of transferring the suburban apartment to your name, as a small token of appreciation for your hard work these past few years in the law family. I lifted my eyes and gave a faint, fragile smile. Dad, I've grown accustomed to living in the big villa now, and I don't want to take what belongs to others. That little apartment was the first property you bought in city years ago. It's better left for you and mother-in-law to live in during your retirement. The atmosphere froze once again. The two lawyers pursed their lips tightly, remaining motionless. A fleeting cold cruelty flashed in father-in-law's eyes, yet his face was incredibly kind, and his voice even gentler than before. It's rare to see such filial devotion from you. Since you just woke up today, rest well and take care of your health first. We can discuss the rest later. As father-in-law left, mother-in-law's confused voice came from the corridor. Not going to the company anymore? Why? Didn't you say that every day the project stops is a day of lost money? Shut up. The voices and footsteps gradually faded away. I exhaled softly, though 5 days of unconsciousness left my body weak. My mind was unusually clear and sharp. I closed my eyes and began to replay everything. Simon is the most cautious and careful person I have ever known. For a long time after marrying Calvin, I was excluded from the core affairs of this family. I was unaware of the family's financial situation, unfamiliar with the preferences and backgrounds of family members. I knew nothing about the company. As the eldest daughter-in-law, I was merely a figurehead. Even the family butler had more decision-making power than I did. After my grandfather passed away, this situation became even more obvious. Simon doesn't believe me. People who harbor malice deep inside naturally see it in others as well. After I decided to change the status quo, I began to keep my head down, enduring baseless scolding, insults, and mockery, enduring Simon's occasional tests of obedience. I suppose I passed the test. Gradually, Simon allowed me to handle some family affairs. I could carry tea and snacks in and out of the study. I could walk past their conversations as if I were invisible. I could appear at the company as Madame Law. Yeah, who would care about a girl with no background, who hasn't gotten pregnant in 5 years, has to beg quietly for medical expenses, and can be kicked out at any moment? I can still bear the title of the Law family's eldest daughter-in-law, but that's only because Simon is exceptionally cautious in everything he does. He wants dignity, no room for gossip. So even if he divorces the granddaughter of his benefactor, no one outside can fault him. Originally, this day was nearly upon us, but now, Calvin is dead. What a twist steeped in the hues of fate. I sit by the hospital bed, administering acupuncture to myself. The young nurse grew curious again. Ms. Daniela, what are you doing? I told her, I'm letting my body's functions recover to their best state in a short time. Acupuncture can do that? Traditional Chinese medicine is vast and profound. Acupuncture manipulates the flow through the body's meridians, balancing and regulating, strengthening or weakening as needed. Weaken? Is it really possible to weaken the body? The young nurse's eyes widened. I smiled. For example, making someone sleep for a few days without any awareness is also possible. That day, I picked that speeding truck, using the accident to quietly sleep for a few days, because I don't want to put on a show in front of outsiders. Calvin can't handle it. But the doctor said your body isn't seriously harmed. Just take it slow to recover. Why are you in such a hurry to get better? I calmly administered an injection and replied kindly, because I have a few interesting battles to fight next. Chapter 11. Rested in the hospital for 2 days. At noon on the 3rd day, I received a call from the police regarding your husband's case. There are some things we still need to investigate further. Will you come home, or should we come to the hospital? Cooperating with the investigation is every citizen's duty. Go home, I said. Justin came to the hospital to pick me up. He had lost some weight too. His brows and eyes looked sharper and more defined, as if he had suddenly matured a great deal. After the funeral, Dad sent me to the company out of town to handle the handover. I heard you woke up, so I called you several times, but you didn't answer. I sighed softly. The doctor said I need to rest and forbade me from constantly holding my phone. He nodded and said quietly, "So that's how it is." When we arrived at the Law family estate gate, he gently comforted me again. Don't be afraid when you see the police later. They're just conducting routine questioning. Each of us has been asked. I glanced at him, lowered my head, and whispered, "Thank you, Justin. I owe you for when I was unconscious in the hospital. Otherwise, I'm afraid I might never have woken up, and no one would have known." Justin patted my shoulder, his voice restrained. "Sister-in-law, we will always be family." Walking into the law residence, I found the entire first-floor hall filled with people. My parents-in-law were talking with 2 police officers. Nearby, 2 sets of sofas. On one side sat second uncle's family. On the other side, surprisingly, sat Lisa. She was dressed all in black, with a white rose pinned in her hair, probably from staying up too late helping with the funeral arrangements. The dark circles under her eyes were heavy, making her look dry and pale. Compared to me now, well-rested and full of vitality, she looked at least 10 years older. She cast me a faint, dismissive glance, still the usual haughty attitude, not even bothering to acknowledge me. "Daniela, now that we see you're all right, we can finally rest easy." Father-in-law looked at me kindly, his face gentle, showing no trace of the resentment from that day. Mother-in-law snorted lightly. "Relying on Assistant Lisa to handle your own husband's affairs, how can you still have the face to sit in this family?" I sat down leisurely and began to speak slowly. Assistant Lisa's job is simply to assist. She gets paid monthly. If she can't handle something this trivial, isn't she just being kept for nothing? Lisa looked at me in shock, as if she couldn't believe her own ears. Naturally, she was shocked. After all, for nearly 2 years, I had always appeared weak and incompetent in front of her, the madam-in-law she could manipulate effortlessly. Mother-in-law and second uncle's family also showed surprise at my change. Only father-in-law, with his deep, furrowed face, showed little expression. The police cleared his throat and spoke calmly. "Madam-in-law, regarding your husband's unexpected death, you have been unconscious due to the car accident and have not been able to inquire in person. You are here today because of this matter." I nodded. "I will fully cooperate and tell the truth. Your mother-in-law said that day you were supposed to deliver Chinese herbal medicine. So why did you give your husband cephalosporin instead?" I was stunned for a moment. Then my eyes welled up with tears. He complained that the herbal medicine worked too slowly and said he had important work. He asked me to bring him cephalosporin the next time I delivered the medicine. Is there anyone who can testify to this? Why would this need a witness? I asked, somewhat confused. Mother-in-law suddenly snapped sharply. "My son was killed by you. This jinx. If you hadn't suddenly given him cephalosporin, how could he have died just from drinking a little? Maybe you did it on purpose, you deliberately killed him." I widened my eyes, utterly shocked and confused. "Mom, what are you saying? Calvin died because he took cephalosporin and drank alcohol?" the police asked. "You don't know the cause of your husband's death?" I shook my head, eyes red. "No one told me. All I know is it was a sudden acute illness." "That's not right." I suddenly frowned. "He rarely takes Western medicine, so I specifically told him not to drink. Besides, I asked the secretary that day, and he didn't have any social engagements at all." Comrade police officer, under what circumstances did my husband drink? Who took him to the hospital? If that person knew he had taken cephalosporin and still coaxed him into drinking, then maybe my husband's death really wasn't an accident. The police officer hesitated for a moment, then looked at Lisa. "You said that day he was the one who insisted on drinking?" Chapter 12. Assistant Lisa suddenly stood up. "You're not seriously doubting me, are you?" I had no idea he took cephalosporin. His health was already poor. If I had known, how could I have let him drink? And as soon as he showed any reaction, I immediately took him to the hospital. How could I possibly harm him? She was visibly agitated, completely losing her usual calm and grace, and her voice noticeably trembled toward the end. When someone is struck by a blow and utterly exhausted, it's only natural to lose some strength of mind, making emotional ups and downs more likely than usual. I stared at her. "Assistant Lisa, why was Calvin drinking with you that day?" She suddenly stiffened, her face tightening, and she didn't answer. I pressed on relentlessly, asking. He didn't have any social engagements that day, and everyone around knew he'd been sick with a cold for days. No one would have let him drink. So why on earth was he drinking with you? His assistant, That day, the living room fell abruptly silent. All eyes fixed on her. Assistant Lisa. Speak up. Mother-in-law's sharp voice shattered the silence, for the first time turning the accusation toward Lisa. Lisa stood alone in the center, her face flushed, fists clenched and trembling slightly, lips pressed tightly together, silent for a long moment. I looked at her, my gaze thick with sarcasm. The reason for drinking? Of course. She couldn't bring herself to say, because it was one of the essential flirting tactics she and Calvin used in bed. Calvin's physical disability required me to treat him with acupuncture, but since my hand was injured, he naturally turned to Lisa for relief. Originally, every 2 or 3 days was enough to ease the tension, but during my previous acupuncture sessions, I aggravated his physical reactions so much that, during that period, even when he was sick, he had no choice but to seek out Lisa each night. And I had long known that Lisa's arsenal to seduce Calvin into a drunken stupor was varied: handcuffs, whips, restraints, but the constant was always strong white liquor. I honestly don't know how they use it, but I do know they definitely use it. At that moment, everyone was staring at her, waiting for her answer. Lisa gritted her teeth, her face flushed as she spoke. President Law has physiological problems. He needs strong liquor to get going. Mother-in-law didn't understand and snapped angrily. What do you mean by needing liquor to get going? Explain yourself clearly. Lisa trembled at her outburst, sobbing as she said, "It's just that President Law, in bed, needs a lot of stimulation to climax. Enough already. Aren't you ashamed?" Father-in-law cut in with a harsh voice. Mother-in-law suddenly realized and her face contorted. So it's because of this. Just because of this. She suddenly sprang up in fury, stormed over to Lisa, slapped her hard, eyes blazing as she shouted, "You filthy slut. It's because of you, you shameless whore, doing these disgraceful things, that you took my son's life." Lisa was slapped suddenly, stunned for a moment, her face showing disbelief. I lifted my eyes slightly, glancing toward the side of the staircase. There stood a maid I had personally hired, secretly filming with her phone. Family scandals like this must be aired out. It's only interesting when it's blown up loud and clear. Calvin's disgrace, Lisa's hypocrisy, father-in-law's constant talk of dignity, mother-in-law's crude heart masked by forced elegance, and the filthy Law family mansion, all should be laid bare under the sun, for the world to judge, condemn, and spit upon. Chapter 13. Lisa has never endured such humiliation. She covered her face, too afraid to confront her mother-in-law, but glared at me angrily and shouted hoarsely, It's you who did this." Calvin, he had no idea he took cephalosporin. Otherwise, how could he have willingly drunk? You secretly drugged him. It must be so. Now there's no proof. You're the one who truly killed him. Father-in-law remained silent all along, but now, as if suddenly reminded by Lisa's words, he let out a contrived "Ah, Daniela. The police asked who can testify. Yet you keep avoiding the question and cling to Assistant Lisa. Why are you dodging this? Could it be that?" He deliberately left his sentence unfinished, his gaze dark and brooding. I held his gaze for 2 seconds, then slowly spoke. "A witness? Let me think. Second uncle and the others were all there that day. They can testify, right?" I turned my head and looked toward second uncle's family. A cousin shrugged. "I don't recall anything like that. Do any of you remember?" They looked at me coldly but said nothing. I sighed. If the whole family of 4 doesn't remember, that's fine. Calvin's office has surveillance cameras. Comrade police officer. You can check them anytime, although it might involve some business secrets. When it comes to a matter of life and death, we can't worry about that so much. Second uncle frowned, as if recalling something, then suddenly said, "I just remembered. It was indeed Calvin who bought the medicine for Daniela that day. We saw him take it himself." Second aunt immediately caught on. "Yes, and she reminded Daniela twice not to drink alcohol. We all heard it." Lisa shouted at me sharply. "President Law values privacy above all. There are no cameras in the office. You're deceiving the police." I tilted my head. "Is that so? Then maybe I remembered wrong." Second uncle and second aunt's expressions stiffened instantly. That day, Second uncle's entire family was discussing the project investment at Calvin's office. The 4 state-owned enterprise managers simply couldn't explain the source of this mysterious fortune exceeding 40 million. Naturally, they dared not reveal it in public. Looking particularly grim was father-in-law Simon. Regarding the death of his son, Calvin, he might suspect me, or perhaps not. However, after I refused to sign at the hospital, he intended to pin the blame on me. Today, the police interrogation summoned so many people to pressure me face to face. If they find any suspicion against me, all the better. Even if I can't expose that Calvin's accidental death was caused by the medicine I gave him, even if I'm innocent, I will still be subjected to public vilification. Someone as fragile as I am, in such dire straits, if he resorts to his usual hypocritical tactics again, dealing with me would be a breeze. Attack the heart before attacking the person. That's his specialty, just like back then, when he knelt every day to wash my grandfather's feet. Unlike him, I'm better at exploiting the little details in life. For example, I noticed that when Calvin makes phone calls, no matter what he receives, he answers, no matter what is said. It all sounds like gibberish to him. For example, in the Chinese herbal medicine I brewed for him, I adjusted the dosage of 2 ingredients, causing his cold to linger endlessly. For instance, that day after giving him cephalosporin, I served him a bowl of Chinese herbal medicine and, right in front of him, took away a full blister pack of cephalosporin, reinforcing the psychological suggestion that it was the herbal medicine he was taking, not the cephalosporin. Unconscious small gestures cause him to respond habitually when faced with the same situation. Some say this is habit. I call it fate. Chapter 14. What happened that day in the Law family's main hall quickly spread through video clips. For a while, everyone in the Law family became the center of gossip, including the late Calvin. No wonder Madame Law hasn't conceived in 5 years. It turns out he's the one at fault. It's like the thief crying "Stop thief." And he even lost his own life over it. Assistant Lisa looks refined and elegant, but who would have thought she'd be a mistress? And on top of that, play such dirty games behind the scenes. Speaking of which, she's indirectly responsible for President Law's death. I heard Madame Law vowed to beat her every time she sees her from now on. Isn't Madame Law a pianist? How come she acts like a shrew? She's like a completely different person from what we usually see. What kind of pianist is she? Just a girl from the countryside who later hired a teacher to learn 5 pieces. Didn't anyone notice she only ever plays those same few pieces? Never anything else? TSK. That old Mr. Law is always boasting about how dignified he is. But behind closed doors, it's all dirty business. I moved back home, living right at the center of this storm of public opinion. After all, the next act can't go on without me. Justin quit his job at the school and had no choice but to start preparing to take over the company. We would occasionally run into each other in the little garden. I never expected my brother to actually. He sighed, a mixture of regret and bitterness in his voice. Sister-in-law, you've endured so much these past few years. I kept my head down, silent, playing with a freshly picked rose, accidentally pricking my finger, a bead of blood welling up. He was startled, then turned and hurried into the house, returning shortly with a band-aid. I chuckled. This little scratch really doesn't need it, he said seriously. Better to put it on than not. After he applied it, I looked up. I caught him staring at me without blinking. The flowers in the garden made his face flush. Father-in-law truly is a man who knows when to yield and when to stand firm. There was not the slightest change in his attitude toward me. The elder's authority and kindness, as always, were displayed simultaneously before me. Only, the division of shares has been delayed for too long. Yet the new project must go on. Every day of delay means a day of loss. He finally grew anxious. That night at dinner, he suddenly said to me, "Daniela, the lawyer has scheduled the signing of the inheritance distribution agreement for next week." I took a bite of my food and said nothing. He spoke again solemnly. "Of course, the Law family always conducts itself with dignity. Everything will be handled according to the law." Mother-in-law immediately shouted, "Why is it that she's only been married in for a few years, hasn't even had a child, yet she gets such a large share?" Justin spoke up, "Mom, spouses and parents have equal inheritance rights. This is stipulated by law. The Law family has 2 branches, each with 4 sons. Back then, Simon hired a professional lawyer to carefully plan everything, placing all movable and immovable property under the company's name and signing a prenuptial agreement. The whole point is to prevent the daughter-in-law from claiming the inheritance later. If they divorce, the daughter-in-law might not even have the right to live in the original house. But being widowed is a different matter. Inheritance is not restricted by prenuptial agreements. In other words, Simon's carefully planned arrangements actually gave me more inheritance rights because of Calvin's sudden death. Simon's saying this now, at least on the surface, is a concession. I looked up and smiled gently. Dad, I have no objections. He nodded, then casually said, the company's projects can't wait. Tomorrow, you'll come with me to the office to sign and kick off the project. I nodded obediently. All right, Dad. Chapter 15. This is the project that Simon can't stop thinking about. It's a matter of great importance. Not only does it consume the vast majority of the Law family pharmaceutical company's cash flow, but even second uncle's family risked investing over $40 million. This was also the project that grandfather had opposed from the start. So the next day, after all the major and minor shareholders had signed, when it was my turn to sign and declare my position, I put down the pen and spoke calmly. I oppose the project going into production. This simple sentence was like a boulder dropped into a still lake, stirring up a storm. Second uncle could no longer hold back. He slammed the table and stood up in anger. Giving you face and you still have no shame. Simon silenced his shouting with a look. Daniela, tell me, why do you disagree? I looked at him, my gaze icy cold. A little honeysuckle water with some sugar, sold as a Chinese herbal medicine health supplement. Don't you have a conscience? The entire conference room suddenly fell silent. Simon stared at me, his eyes revealing ruthless cruelty for the first time. Without disguise, I met his gaze without fear, confronting him head-on for the first time. Because at this moment, I was not just representing myself. It also stands for grandfather. Grandfather, who spent his life immersed in researching traditional Chinese medicine and promoting it, even lost his life because of it. When I left the company, second uncle's family charged over. You shameless woman, how dare you brazenly terminate the project? Do you really think you can inherit the shares? You're seriously delusional. You must compensate us for the interest lost from all those transfers. I looked coldly at the 4 of them. When they first arrived in City A, under Simon's arrangement, they used grandfather's connections to get into the state-owned enterprise, one after another, which is how they secured their current social standing. By now, it had long since decayed beyond repair. I tilted my head and asked, interest money? What interest money? My cousin sneered. Your late husband borrowed a large sum from us for investment, now that the project is halted because of you. Besides repaying the principal, the lost interest is naturally your responsibility. Not much. Just a few million or so. I let out a bitter laugh. I never heard anything about borrowing money for investment. Second uncle mocked. What right do you have to know about company matters? The IOU is crystal clear. Just wait to pay up. And what if I don't pay? I took a slow step back. Not paying it back either? Are you seriously planning to sue me over an IOU? I watched with satisfaction as the 4 faces before me suddenly stiffened, their pupils gradually dilating. It was as if they had only just realized something. Even if I don't pay it back, they can't sue me, because once the ownership of this money is made public, the source of this huge fortune must be explained, and they can't explain it. The crime of unexplained vast wealth carries a maximum sentence of 10 years. 2 of my cousins' faces twisted instantly as they growled and rushed at me to attack. 2 tall bodyguards immediately appeared beside me, effortlessly pinning the 2 men to the ground. From the moment I decided to confront Simon head-on, I knew I had to guarantee my own personal safety. I sold several of Calvin's watches and hired 4 bodyguards to stand guard around the clock. At that moment, I lowered my cold gaze, watching the people on the ground groaning in pain. Next time any of you dare to offend me again, I'll make sure your entire family leaves City A exactly the way they came in. Do you believe me? The 4 of them stared at me, frozen. Their eyes betrayed a strange and deep fear. Chapter 16. I didn't go back to the law residence. My face was already torn. Facing them would only put me at a disadvantage. I moved into an apartment I had rented 6 months earlier. Justin called me. his voice heavy with complex emotions. My family doesn't define me. I gazed out at the blue sky, my tone even. Justin, none of what I've done is aimed at you. Daniela, once everything's settled, I'll take you somewhere else to clear your mind, okay? I was silent for a moment, then said, all right. A week later, arranged by the lawyer, I attended the inheritance distribution meeting for Calvin. The meeting was held at the largest law firm in the city. Because the inheritance was complex and substantial, several professional lawyers were present. Present were Calvin's first-order heirs, father-in-law Simon, mother-in-law Margarita, and I, the spouse. Simon maintained a stern expression, clearly resigned to accepting the distribution plan. As the lawyer read through each asset category, the door suddenly opened, and Lisa entered holding Noah's hand. She lifted her head, slowly scanning the room, then raised a piece of paper and spoke loudly. This is a paternity test report. Noah is Calvin's biological son. I demand a redistribution of the inheritance. After Lisa finished speaking, her gaze locked onto me, stripped of any former restraint or sense of propriety, turning slowly sarcastic and provocative. Understandably, she had endured far too much. The last video incident had fully exposed her semi-public status as a mistress. There was no longer any reason to hide anything. Her arrival was no surprise to my parents-in-law. Noah even took the initiative to walk over and call out, "Grandfather, grandmother." Simon patted the child's head. "Good boy. Tonight you'll stay with grandfather. Grandfather will leave your dad's room for you." Lisa's eyes reddened, nearly shedding tears. This was what she had longed for all these years. When we finally sat down, the conference table was sharply divided. On one side were grandfather and grandmother's mistress and the illegitimate child. On the other side, there was only me. The lawyer asked me, "Law, madam, the paternity test has been verified without error. I must inform you that Noah is indeed Calvin's legal heir. Do you have anything to say?" I glanced at the three adults opposite me, each wearing a different expression. They were all looking at me as well. Father-in-law looked sinister. Mother-in-law was full of resentment. Lisa's chest rose and fell slightly, both excited and proud. I spoke slowly, posing a question. "May I ask the lawyer, if the deceased left a will, which should be followed?" The lawyer replied, "Of course, the will takes precedence over statutory inheritance." That's good," I said, lowering my head as I took a laminated paper from my handbag. Smiling faintly, "This is Calvin's handwritten will, clearly stating in black and white that all his property is to be inherited by his child born in wedlock." The three people opposite suddenly widened their eyes. Impossible. The usually most composed father-in-law was the first to shout out at that moment. "My son is so young. How could he possibly make a will for no reason? It must be fake." Mother-in-law also started shouting. Lisa sneered repeatedly. "Child born in wedlock? Dream on, you're not even worthy of having children with Calvin." The lawyer took the will and examined it carefully. "Madam Law, this will still requires further verification of its authenticity, but it states that the inheritance goes to the child born in wedlock. As far as I know, you don't have any children, so even if it's genuine, the conditions of this will are not met." "Ah, yes." Father-in-law Simon calmed down and spoke grimly. "Daniela, even if you deceived Calvin into signing the will, he has always been a clever man. He included this non-existent child born in wedlock as a restrictive clause. Your efforts were utterly in vain." I smiled at him slowly. "But I am pregnant." Chapter 17. Half a year ago, a project that Calvin was managing was suddenly halted, urgently needing someone to smooth things over. Grandfather once saved an important person's life, and over the years I have carefully nurtured my relationship with her. We call each other godmother and goddaughter. Calvin had no choice but to come to me for help. When I first married Calvin, he was, in both my grandfather's and my eyes, a quiet, diligent young man with ambition. At that time, none of us had any idea. It turned out that some people treat crafting a public image as their ultimate survival skill. Simon crafted his image as grateful, dutiful, and never forgetting his roots. He shaped his son's image as simple, honest, and hardworking. What I didn't know was that Calvin had been dating Lisa for years while courting me, and just before our wedding, Lisa found out she was pregnant. to secure a foothold in City A through grandfather's position as chairman. Simon broke up the couple, and Lisa endured humiliation and hardship, going abroad to give birth to the child. What a pair of tragic lovers they are. After marriage, Calvin was always indifferent to me. I thought that was just his nature, coupled with my long inability to conceive. Life in the Law family was unbearably difficult. It was only much later that I realized his coldness toward me was because he blamed me for all the debts incurred by separating his lover and his son. After grandfather passed away, he didn't even bother to keep up appearances. After Calvin found me, I knelt before my godmother, begging her to do me a favor. So that day, when Calvin cautiously brought up the project in front of my godmother, she jokingly set a condition. My godmother, having just endured a fierce inheritance battle over an illegitimate child, said that as her goddaughter, I was utterly alone with no support, and asked how he could genuinely guarantee my future interests. My godmother is a master at steering conversations. After some joking banter, Calvin handwrote a will. Of course, he left himself a way out. Clearly stated, it can only be left to a child born in wedlock. In his mind at the time, he was young and expected to live a long life. Besides, it was impossible for me to have children with him, so he was completely fearless. 3 months ago, I carefully selected a perfectly flawless sperm at a sperm bank and successfully conceived. Chapter 18. In the conference room, Lisa shouted sharply, "It's impossible, you can't have his child. He had himself sterilized long ago. The only condition I set when I agreed to marry him was that he get sterilized." What? Mother-in-law stared at her in shock. No wonder my son never had children all these years, you actually had him sterilized. It turns out you, that vile woman, schemed so maliciously, and you even caused him to lose his life. She grew increasingly agitated, grabbing Lisa's meticulously styled hair with one hand while slapping her face fiercely with the other. The conference room echoed with sharp smack sounds. Others hurried to pull them apart, but mother-in-law's grip was so strong they couldn't break free. I watched them silently, a bitter smile curling in my heart. So it turns out Calvin was sterilized long ago. No wonder. During the 2 years before we got married, while I was trying to get pregnant, enduring my mother-in-law's scolding and swallowing bitter medicine bowl after bowl, he just looked at me with a faint sneer. No wonder that will, he wrote it so effortlessly. So this is where it all began. Don't hit my mother. Noah started crying loudly, grabbed the ashtray from the conference table, and smashed it down on his mother-in-law's head. A bright red stream of blood slowly trickled down her forehead. Mother-in-law stared at her grandson in shock, screaming, "You little bastard. You're not Calvin's son at all." Lisa broke free from her grasp, covering her swollen face, glaring at me with hatred. Not his child, right? Someone else's seed, right? I studied her face for a moment and smiled. Sterilization isn't 100% effective. The child in my belly is obviously his. She gritted her teeth. You can't produce a paternity test, so you can't prove it's his child. I laughed out loud. Have you forgotten? I am the lawful wife. I don't need to prove parentage. As for proving otherwise, well, there's nothing to be done, after all. Calvin has already turned to ashes. Bang! The sound of a chair toppling over. Simon, who had been silent all along, suddenly fell straight backward. He fainted. The conference room instantly descended into chaos. I turned my head and looked at the lawyers. Speaking casually, I am entrusting my inheritance case to you lawyers. Several lawyers stood up in unison, their expressions excited. Thank you for your trust. Thank you, Madam Law, for your trust. I smiled with satisfaction. I extended a finger, pointing at Lisa. The first thing is, as the original wife, to reclaim every bit of the marital property that this mistress took, not a penny less. Lisa's face turned deathly pale. Her whole body began to tremble violently. Amid the chaos, I walked out of the conference room. Chapter 19. A few days later, Justin came to see me. Our current statuses are somewhat awkward, although there's no grudge between us. Now, with all the mess surrounding the Law family, no one can remain unscathed. You're carrying my brother's child? He asked me, stunned. I sighed and touched my belly. No matter what, he is now your brother's only legitimate heir. Justin closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, His gaze was restrained but determined. What if I don't mind? Don't mind what? Don't mind whose child this is, whether it's your brother's or not. Daniela, would you be willing to be with me? His fingers trembled as he looked at me with excitement. This was the first time he had openly expressed his feelings to me, with a certain desperate resolve. I said nothing. His eyes suddenly reddened, his expression utterly desolate. I know it's impossible now. If this child had no inheritance rights, maybe I'd still have a faint hope. But now, I know we will never, ever be possible. Actually, I had already booked a plane ticket, ready to leave this place of heartbreak. He suddenly held his head, his voice choked with emotion. Why? Is money really that important? For money. To give up family and love, I don't understand. I really don't understand. I watched him, pained and confused, silent, without a word. Justin suddenly looked up, his eyes shining. Daniela, how about we be a couple for a day? These past few years, seeing you and my brother, I was so jealous I didn't want to go home. I've always wanted to be alone with you, doing nothing at all, just like an ordinary couple, shopping, watching movies. Is that okay? I agreed. Justin was the only one in all these years who showed me kindness. Such a simple request. What's there not to agree to? Chapter 20. Late summer had arrived, and the morning air carried a faint chill. I walked alone, slowly making my way to the law residence. The butler opened the door, and I headed straight to the poolside. Simon was swimming. It was a habit he had cultivated over many years. Unless the weather was particularly cold, he would swim 500 meters every morning at 8 o'clock without fail. At one moment, when he surfaced from the water, he saw me. His eyes flashed with shock, but he quickly regained his composure. The inheritance was tied up in litigation. It was a long process. After all, my child hadn't been born yet, so the eligibility to inherit was still pending. I dragged a chair over and sat down, trying to make myself comfortable. Shocked to see me show up, I looked at him and asked. Simon slowly got out of the water, drying himself with a towel. Looks like I need to change the staff in this house. I've been letting just anyone in. I smiled. Are you sure you'll still have the money to hire so many servants after my child is born? Simon calmly said. The baby isn't born yet, so why rush? He turned around, preparing to go inside and get dressed. I suddenly spoke up. Guess where Justin is right now? Simon stopped, slowly turned around, and stared at me. Why are you asking this all of a sudden? I tilted my head, my voice steady. Yesterday Justin came to see me. He said he had always liked me. Seeing how far you all have come, he knew he had no chance. So he made a small request. He wanted me to be his nominal girlfriend for a day. Well, how to put it? He's one of the few in your family who's been kind to me. So of course I agreed. So, we went to see a movie, strolled through the snack street, and even climbed a small hill in the countryside. I spoke calmly and deliberately. Simon didn't interrupt me. He listened in silence. On the mountain path, we walked side by side. I suddenly asked him, "Aren't you tired?" He smiled and asked why I was asking. I sighed. After all the pretense and charade played out before me for so long, how could I not be exhausted? I pointed at Simon and laughed. Exactly. Justin's reaction back then was just like yours now, utterly dumbfounded. Simon's voice began to tremble. Where is Justin now? What have you done to him? I tilted my head and remained silent for a long moment. He reached out, as if to grab my neck. I warned him kindly. There are plenty of cameras at home. If anything you do to me ends up as evidence in court, and you try to get rid of the child to seize the family assets, wouldn't that be a futile effort? He pressed his lips tightly, struggling to compose himself. Daniela, you wouldn't hurt Justin, no matter how bold you are. You wouldn't do something like that. You came today just to provoke me. I applauded with appreciation. As expected of the head of the law family, you immediately saw through my intention. I truly wouldn't hurt him. I'm simply giving him a taste of his own medicine. Simon trembled. What do you mean? I looked at him and slowly smiled. It's nothing much, just that by the roadside on the mountain path, in the car Justin had arranged beforehand, I escaped and left him behind. My bodyguard said those people specialize in selling people to Myanmar, regardless of gender, as long as they have someone. I was worried they wouldn't fancy Justin, but to my surprise, they were very satisfied with me. At this rate, he's probably already over there. Simon started trembling all over, his lips quivering. You bitch. How dare you? How dare you do that to my son? I covered my mouth and laughed out loud. What's there to be afraid of? I've already done it once with Calvin. This time it's basically copy and paste. No, even simpler. Since this path was planned by Justin himself. Simon stared wide-eyed, incoherent. Calvin, it really is you. It really is you. Why? Why so cruel? I looked at him and said slowly, because of what you all did to my grandfather. I have to repay it tenfold. 100-fold to be fair. Don't you think? Seeing his pale face, I continued. When I was planning Calvin's death, I hesitated for a long time. Don't get me wrong. It wasn't because I couldn't bear it, but because death seemed too simple. It wasn't until I later painstakingly studied acupuncture techniques that I planted a hidden illness in him every time I treated him. When he has a disulfiram-like reaction from mixing cephalosporin with alcohol, causing dilation of the blood vessels in his head, it simultaneously triggers trigeminal neuralgia. Medically, a disulfiram-like reaction rates as pain level 7 to 8, trigeminal neuralgia as 8 to 10, and combined, Calvin's pain before death barely gives me a shred of comfort. Simon's mouth suddenly twisted, straining hard toward the back right, his neck tilting the same way, as if an invisible rope behind him was pulling his face backward with all its might. Bang! Simon collapsed flat on the ground, foaming at the mouth, twitching incessantly. I lowered my eyes, staring at him coldly. Is that how you looked at my grandfather as he struggled to die back then? Chapter 21. When I left, I had the butler call 120. Death is far too simple. What I want is for the most important, most treasured thing in his life to slip away from him, to turn a man who constantly preaches about dignity into someone who feels humiliation every single moment. I said, Simon is an extremely cautious man. He is skilled at strategizing, whether in life, business, family, or even his own household. He never puts all his eggs in one basket. So even when dealing with someone as insignificant as me, he arranged both a public face and a private one. The public face is Calvin, but because of Lisa and Noah, he has always treated me coldly. So Simon arranged another private face, Justin. When I was bullied in the law family, Justin was like a timely flower of understanding that gave me warmth, controlling me, yet always wary of me. Come to think of it, I still have to thank Justin. If it weren't for him vouching for me, with Simon's personality, it would have been nearly impossible for an outsider like me, harboring a deep grudge, to earn his trust. Simon's fate is the one I anticipate most. Living in humiliation and pain is the best outcome he can hope for. He is 64 years old, suffers from hypertension and diabetes, and doctors have repeatedly warned him to be cautious of stroke during past visits. The weather is cold and crisp today. I chose this very moment to come. He swam ashore, and the cold breeze caused his blood vessels to constrict. As he was about to go inside and change, I deliberately informed him of Justin's fate. After the initial shock, I intensified matters by recounting Calvin's agonizing death, underlying illnesses, weather, environment, psychological triggers, multiple factors piled up together. He had a stroke, a rather serious one, too. I am very satisfied. Chapter 22. Half a year later, I gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby boy. The sole heir was born, and my inheritance case was a complete victory, since the law family's movable and immovable properties were originally under the company's name. After I inherited all the shares of Calvin's company, I also inherited everything else, including that villa, but I still kept an apartment for Simon and Margarita. It was the very apartment they bought when they came to City A. I said it was to be left to them for their retirement. A promise is a promise. I often go to that apartment to check on the old couple. Margarita seems quite afraid of me. That time, I accidentally spilled some water on my shoes, and she hurriedly knelt down to wipe them repeatedly with her sleeve. Of course, she doesn't know about Calvin and Justin, because besides me, Only Simon knows the whole story. Simon had a stroke, unable to speak or stand. Every day, he can only drool and make ah sounds. At my suggestion, Margarita removed all the furniture suitable for sitting or lying down, leaving Simon barely able to lean on one leg and half a movable shoulder. Dragging himself around the room every day, saliva pooled all over the floor. I often invited some of his former friends to come see him. His eyes were filled with pain and humiliation, sometimes streaming with 2 lines of murky tears, while he kept making ah sounds. I sold the Law family pharmaceutical business. I sold it at a low price to a company genuinely committed to researching Chinese herbal medicine. During the marriage, Calvin gave Lisa money, houses, bags, and jewelry, totaling over $28 million. Most of it was recovered, leaving very little behind. Lisa lost her job and money, and came to Margarita several times with Noah to cause trouble. Margarita was left with an ugly scar on her forehead. She would curse loudly whenever she saw the mother and son. I never heard any news about Justin again. I don't know how he is doing in Myanmar. Epilogue. Lucas woke up. On a gentle, ordinary sunny day, I was sitting beside him, peeling an apple, when I suddenly felt something was different. Looking up, Lucas's bright eyes were fixed on me, unblinking. Those were eyes I remembered. He struggled, summoning all his strength, and said to me, "From now on, older brother will protect you." Tears streamed down my face. Yes, he knew everything. Older brother knew everything. My pain, my struggle, my helplessness, my fear, every agonizing day and night, had all been poured out by his bedside. I thought I was completely alone, but it turns out I wasn't. Older brother has always been there for me. He lives in his own world, just like me, fighting with all his strength, to be reunited with me. At last, I have family who love me once again. Story 2. As soon as I got off the plane, a college classmate I wasn't very familiar with suddenly hugged me. "Laura, I missed you so much." The next second, a woman stormed over and slapped me several times. She called me a homewrecker and then turned to question him. "Eric, is this what you meant by working overtime?" Knocked to the ground, I suddenly saw strange words flashing before my eyes. Those slaps were epic. This dream girl is such a manipulative coquette. The heroine is about to awaken. Only then did I realize I was the second female lead in a wife-chasing romance novel. Without hesitation, I pulled out my phone and called for help, crying pitifully, "Officer, help me! I'm being assaulted." The male and female leads? This is a relationship dispute. How did it escalate to a criminal case? Chapter 1. When the police arrived and saw the obvious red marks on my cheek, they immediately took Eric and his wife Selena to the station. After some questioning, it was determined that the injuries I sustained didn't qualify as serious. In the end, they gave them 2 options: either settle privately with compensation or face 5 days of detention. Eric looked at me with concern and asked, "Laura, are you okay? Does it hurt?" As he spoke, he even tried to reach out and touch my face. Annoyed, I swatted his hand away. Selena, his wife, glared at me indignantly. "But she's a homewrecker. As the rightful wife, can't I even hit the mistress?" At that moment, those strange sentences appeared before my eyes again. Looks like this dream girl isn't easy to deal with. She interfered in someone else's marriage and still had the nerve to call the police? The heroine should hurry up and divorce him. Let these 2 scumbags be together. I frowned and said calmly, "I don't want money. Detain her." Then I left the mess behind, thinking I'd never see either of them again. But that night, I was added to a group chat. In it were Eric and a few other guys. Eric apologized profusely and confessed his feelings for me yet again. The other guys started egging me on to forgive him. "Come on, just forgive Eric. Everyone knows how much he's in love with you. Yeah, he's had a crush on you for years. From college until now, he's waited for you all this time. Now that you're finally back, don't you think you should give him a chance?" Feeling suspicious, I clicked into my chat history with Eric. Back in college, I was on the student council, so I had contact information from most of my classmates. Opening the chat, I fell into deep thought. It turned out Eric was the same guy who once created a huge heart out of flower petals under the dorm building for me. At the time, I had been completely dumbfounded by the gesture. All I wanted was to quickly head back to my dorm, but his friends blocked my way and dragged me into the heart made of petals. With everyone watching, Eric confessed his love to me. All the onlookers started cheering. Say yes! Say yes! I was instantly put on the spot. Looking at this guy I barely knew, I gently declined. I'm sorry. It's not you. It's me. I'm just not ready for a relationship right now. After that, I set his messages to do not disturb. Now, opening this old chat, I realized that all these years, Eric had been messaging me. The message he sent most frequently was, I'll wait for you. When you're ready to date, we'll be together. Chapter 2. When I rejected him back then, I was trying to be tactful. It was only because there were so many classmates present that I phrased it that way. I never thought Eric would take it as me asking him to wait for me. For a moment, I couldn't wrap my head around how men think. If tact didn't work, I'd just be blunt this time. I responded directly in the group chat. I don't like Eric. Please stop bothering me from now on. After sending the message, I immediately left the group. But I soon realized it wasn't about whether I was tactful or blunt. Some people will always interpret what others say the way they want to hear it. The next day, I went to my father's company. I had returned to the country because my father's health was failing, and as his only daughter, I needed to take over the business. But as I arrived at the building, I ran into Eric, who was just getting off work. Seeing him, I quickened my pace, silently praying he wouldn't notice me. Fate had other plans. He called out to me immediately, Laura, do you work here too? Relieved that he didn't know the company belonged to my father, I quickly replied, no, I was just passing by. He gave me a once-over and then smiled. I'm a director at this company. I had no idea what he was trying to convey. No one asked him. Anyway, sensing the awkwardness, he turned to the child he was holding and said, Lucas, say hi to Auntie Laura. This is the Auntie Laura I've been telling you about. Isn't she pretty? So he even had a child. I didn't want to stay another second. I turned to leave, but the child clung to my leg, saying, Auntie Laura is so beautiful, prettier than mommy. I looked at Eric with disgust. This must have been something he taught his kid. Once again, those bizarre phrases flashed before my eyes. Like father, like son. Sure, kid, laugh now. Wait until your mom leaves you. Then you'll be crying. Exactly. Can't wait to see you and your dad in the heroine's rejection arc. I pried the child off my leg and turned to Eric, speaking firmly. You already have a family. Please stop harassing me. I've made it clear that I don't like you. If this continues, I'll call the police. Eric stared at me, stunned, and said nothing more. He simply took the child and left. Since Eric worked at my father's company, I knew running into him was inevitable. I had prepared myself for that. But over the next few days, I didn't see Eric. Instead, his wife Selena came looking for me. Chapter 3. I was working on my laptop in the cafe next to the company when Selena suddenly sat down across from me. Her eyes were red, and she started crying. Laura, why won't you leave my family alone? Her words immediately drew the attention of everyone around us, but she ignored their stares and continued her sob story. You clearly know my husband works here, yet you still chased after him to join the same company? You've stolen my husband, and now even my son says you're prettier than me when he comes home. He says he doesn't want his ugly mom anymore, he wants you, his beautiful mom. I felt utterly baffled. Still, out of consideration for her as a fellow woman, I tried to console her. Maybe that just means your son has been influenced by Eric. Eric is the kind of man who can't stay loyal. I suggest you divorce him sooner rather than later. Otherwise, your son will probably grow up to be just as ungrateful. I didn't expect the word divorce to completely change Selena's expression. Her face turned guarded, almost paranoid. You want us to get divorced so you can take my place, don't you? She sneered. You're really something, acting all fake and pretending to give me advice. She suddenly stood up, her eyes blazing with anger. Let me tell you something, you homewrecker, you'll never have a happy ending. That so-called dream girl? If he marries you, let's see if he'll still love you. I couldn't help but laugh in anger. Sorry, but I wouldn't even look at a man like Eric. Besides, I've only just returned to the country. I have nothing to do with him. Selena sneered. Then why did you even come back? If you liked living abroad so much, why didn't you just stay there? Why bother coming back and contacting Eric? At that point, I realized just how delusional the characters in wife-chasing romance stories could be. None of them were remotely normal. I explained. I didn't contact him. Maybe he saw my post on social media. As I said this, I realized how it sounded, like I was trying to prove my innocence. Frowning, I added, "It's my choice whether to come back or not. What does that have to do with him?" Selena, however, took my words as a challenge. She grabbed the glass of water on the table and threw it in my face. "You just wait," she snarled before storming off. As I wiped the water from my face with a napkin, those bizarre phrases appeared again. Yes, the heroine is finally waking up. Go tear apart that scumbag and the mistress. But if she knows the male lead still can't let go of his dream girl, why doesn't she just divorce him? You're so naive. If she divorces now, wouldn't that let those two scumbags off too easily? Exactly. She needs to gather evidence, make him lose everything, and take all his money. Chapter 4. When my girlfriends found out I was back in the country, they insisted on throwing me a welcome party. After getting dressed up and arriving, I was surprised to see Eric and his group of friends there too. As soon as Eric saw me, he hurried over. He poured me a drink, handed me tissues, and kept hovering around. I instinctively stepped aside and made sure to sit as far away from him as possible. Noticing my discomfort, one of my girlfriends explained, "Oh, Laura, you probably don't know yet. Alice is dating one of Eric's friends now, so that was why Eric and his group were here." Since it had been years since I'd seen my girlfriends, I didn't want to ruin the mood, so I decided not to say anything further. But Eric's friends soon suggested playing some games. After losing several rounds in a row, I ended up drinking quite a bit. Eric immediately leaned over, picked up my glass, and drank it for me. His friends started teasing him, saying how chivalrous he was. I, on the other hand, felt sick to my stomach. Seizing the opportunity, Eric slid into the seat next to me and even put an arm around my shoulders. "Laura, you know I've been in love with you for so many years. I've waited for you all this time." Struggling to free myself, I snapped. "What do you mean, waited for me all these years? You're married. And can you stop brainwashing yourself into thinking you've sacrificed so much for me?" The next second, I was shoved to the ground. Selena stood there, holding her phone, snapping photos of me. "You really can't get enough of being a homewrecker, can you?" she shouted. "And you, Eric, is the food at home so tasteless that you find garbage outside delicious instead?" Eric instinctively tried to help me up but froze when he saw Selena losing control. He immediately turned to calm her down. Selena was shaking with rage. "Eric, I'm divorcing you," she declared. "You're a director, aren't you? After the divorce, I want you to pay $10,000 a month in child support. And I'm taking the car and the house." As soon as she finished speaking, those familiar words appeared before me again. Finally, the heroine is asking for a divorce. Look at the scumbag's shocked expression. Let the wife-chasing nightmare begin. Humph, that so-called dream girl? She's about to get dumped by the male lead. I clenched my fists as I watched the scene unfold in front of me. Over the past few days at the company, I had been reviewing the financial accounts in detail. Something wasn't adding up, and I began to suspect Eric, the financial director. Sure enough, I found some suspicious discrepancies. Following the trail, I soon uncovered evidence of Eric embezzling company funds. A wife-chasing story? Fine, let's play that game. But I'll make sure you and your dear wife bear the weight of this massive debt together. Chapter 5. As soon as Eric heard the word divorce, he immediately ran after Selena. It was my friends who helped me back to my feet. They spoke softly. "We heard Eric still likes you, even now, and you've been single for a few years, so we thought." Clenching my teeth, I snapped. "Do you even realize that Eric has a wife and a child?" And for the record, the reason I'm single is that I haven't met a man worth my time. Being single doesn't mean I'll settle for just any man. With that, I grabbed my bag and left. Later, at work, I overheard my colleagues saying that Eric had taken a few days off. Apparently, his wife was really divorcing him and had packed up to move to another city. Eric, of course, had immediately taken his son and rushed to that city to win her back. I thought Eric's wife-chasing drama meant my life would finally quiet down, but I never expected Selena to upload a video of that night online. The video was shot from behind, making it look like Eric had his arm around me. It showed Selena pushing me aside, cursing me out, and declaring her intent to divorce Eric. From that brief 30-second clip, it looked like Eric had been caught red-handed, and I was the homewrecker. In the caption, Selena wrote that Eric was a director at a prestigious company, and implied that I was either seduced by his looks or greedy for his money. Sure enough, the internet exploded with hate. How can a woman stoop so low as to become a mistress? People like this are disgusting. Ugh. She probably just didn't want to work hard and decided to go after money instead. I saw this mistress at a cafe once. She looked so smug. Whispering here, but I think this woman is new at our company. To the commenter above, let me tell you quietly, her relationship with the boss isn't simple. Well, it figures. Someone like her can only sell her body, clearly no real skills. Chapter 6. That day, my father held a meeting to announce to the entire company that I would be taking over full oversight of the business moving forward. As soon as he made the announcement, murmurs spread across the room. Everyone knew that my father didn't just value competence when choosing employees, he placed even greater emphasis on character. This was a well-known fact within the company. Someone suddenly spoke up. Boss, she has some negative news online. Won't that affect the company's reputation? Clearly, my father wasn't aware of this, and he looked at me in confusion. Seeing that my father knew nothing, others immediately jumped in. The scandal is all over the internet. How can we let someone like this represent our company? Just like the rumors say, people like her only sell their bodies because they have no actual skills. It was obvious they assumed my relationship with my father was improper, never imagining that we were, in fact, father and daughter. I calmly explained, those are baseless rumors. I'll resolve the situation before taking over the company's affairs. As for my abilities, it's not something I can just claim, I'll prove it through action. To clear my name, I publicly shared screenshots of years' worth of messages from Eric, all of which I had never responded to. I also posted photos showing that I'd been abroad for years, proving I had little to no interaction with Eric during that time. I thought this would be enough to end the farce, but I never expected Eric to jump into the fray, claiming that I had seduced him for his money. He even said the chat logs I posted were fake and edited with Photoshop. Selena also posted an update, saying, after thorough investigation, it's clear my husband was indeed seduced, but he's paid me a 100,000 yuan fine and has repeatedly proven his love for this family. Not only did my clarification fail to clear my name, but it also brought even more attention and backlash. More people started criticizing me. When my father learned the truth, he told me to stay home for the next few days. Some extreme netizens had even found my address, throwing garbage at my door and sending funeral flowers. Those strange words reappeared at this point. Yes, the homewrecker is finally getting her comeuppance. But did the heroine really take him back just like that? Where's the strong, independent female lead arc we were promised? The heroine just wanted the male lead's money. Chill, she'll probably leave once she's had enough. Why do I feel like the second female lead is actually being wronged here? She seems like she was dragged into this mess. Seeing that last comment stirred something deep inside me. Finally, someone had noticed my innocence. Finally, someone realized I had been dragged into this unwillingly. But before I could feel relief, another comment quickly countered it. To anyone who feels bad for the second female lead, I hope your husband finds his own dream girl too. Chapter 7. After Eric managed to bring Selena back home, she even came to confront me, gloating. I heard you mistresses have a classic line, the one who's not loved is the real homewrecker. Are you ready to admit you're the mistress now? I found her antics ridiculous and immediately blocked her. But a few days later, Eric messaged me again. Laura, I'm sorry. The things I posted online, Selena forced me to do it. She's holding something over me, so I had no choice. Just wait for me. Once I deal with her and get the divorce, I'll come find you. I casually took screenshots of his messages and posted them online. This time, I was determined to clear my name once and for all. After that, I headed to the company. I had already gathered evidence that Eric, as the financial director, had been embezzling company funds and taking kickbacks. And it wasn't just him, several others in the finance department were involved. This time, I was determined to rid the company of all these parasites. What I didn't expect was to run into Selena in the elevator. When she saw me, her expression shifted from disbelief to fury. She immediately pulled out her phone and started recording me. "How shameless can you be?" she yelled, "chasing after my husband all the way to his company?" I ignored her and walked straight to the office area. When Eric saw me, he came out of the break room, looking overjoyed. "Laura, did you come here for me?" I smiled. "For once, you're right." As soon as the words left my mouth, Selena, standing behind me, spoke loudly into her phone. "Friends online. Take a look. The mistress has chased my husband all the way to his company." "That's right. I just came to deliver lunch to my husband. And look what I found." It seemed Selena was live streaming. She probably thought she'd unlocked the secret to internet fame. Dropping my smile, I said coldly, "I'm not just here for you, but also for the other employees in your department who've been stealing from the company." Everyone, meeting in the conference room, the seriousness of this matter had to be made clear to all employees. The staff hesitated, reluctant to leave their desks, clearly not taking me seriously. That's when my father's stern voice rang out. "Didn't you hear her?" Chapter 8. The conference room was packed, not just with all the employees but also with Selena. I didn't ask her to leave. In fact, I welcomed the chance to prove my innocence. I got straight to the point. "Eric, you're fired." The room fell into stunned silence. Everyone exchanged bewildered glances. No one looked more lost than Eric himself. "Laura, are you even part of this company?" he asked, his confusion plain. The murmurs started. Is the boss out of his mind? Letting a mistress fire someone? Looks like he's trying to avenge his mistress. Isn't she Eric's lover? Well, this company's doomed if mistresses can become the boss now. Selena seized the moment to taunt me into her phone camera. See? Absolutely shameless. Not only did she seduce my husband, but now she's seducing the big boss too. Everyone, take a good look at her true colors. I slammed my hand on the table, silencing the room. "Let me introduce myself. I'm Laura, the daughter of your boss. As his only child, my father has entrusted me with taking over the company's operations. Any questions?" Without wasting more time, I plugged a USB drive into the computer and projected the screen. These are the records proving that Eric, along with several others in the finance department, embezzled company funds and took kickbacks from company projects. I've already sent these to our lawyer. "Eric, you'll be facing a lawsuit very soon." Eric's face turned deathly pale as he saw the evidence. He almost lost his balance, grabbing onto the table for support. "Laura, why are you doing this to me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "You know how much I've liked you all these years." Before he could finish, Selena stormed over and slapped him hard across the face. "Eric, even now, you're still thinking about your dream girl? Have you forgotten what you promised me just days ago?" I frowned, looking at Eric with disgust. "Your so-called love has caused serious damage to my life. I've rejected you countless times, yet you cling to me like a leech. And let's be clear, this isn't love. It's just your wounded ego acting out because you can't have what you want." Selena, her face twisted with rage, pointed a finger at me. "You fox spirit. What kind of spell have you cast on him?" Chapter 9. I sighed and said, "Selena, you know perfectly well that the reason your family is falling apart is Eric. If you're not divorcing him, then what's your reason for staying?" Selena lifted her chin, smiling. "I'm the wife. Should I divorce now just to give you my spot? Don't think I don't see how you're trying to compete with me. You think you've won by taking him away, and now you must feel so superior, right? And besides, do you really think I'm staying for love? I'm staying for the money. I was baffled. What does this marriage have to do with money? Noticing my confusion, she smirked. I've sacrificed so many years for this marriage, having a child, raising a child. Of course. I can't just divorce and walk away easily. Eric hasn't given me enough money yet. Do you think I'm like you, putting love above all else? I value the benefits. Looking at her, I couldn't help but think she had gone mad. Selena kept insisting it was all about money, but every word she said revolved around Eric. Does money have to come from a man? At least for me, it doesn't. She launched into a long speech trying to prove she wasn't ruled by emotions but was instead an empowered woman. What it means to be a strong, independent woman, I can't say, but I do know that as an independent person, you should never rely on anyone else. Seeing her stubbornness, I didn't want to waste any more words. I said coldly, since you're unwilling to divorce, then you and Eric can share his massive debts as a married couple. If you can't manage it, then prison it is. Selena's face turned ashen at my words. She looked utterly lost and collapsed onto the floor. I calmly watched these two panicked individuals, as well as the strange text only I could see. What's going on? Is the heroine's character falling apart? What kind of strong woman is this? She seems overly attached. This wife-chasing story feels so weird. I'm starting not to hate the second female lead anymore. Honestly, the second female lead feels more like the strong, independent one. She doesn't even care about the scumbag and is focused on her career. Don't worry. I think the heroine is just setting a big trap to take down these two cheaters. At this point, these chaotic comments left me unfazed. I was almost numb to them. Selena covered her face and left the room crying. Eric looked at me, hesitated, and then stumbled after her. More text appeared. Here we go. The male lead is finally realizing how good the heroine is. Too late. Scumbag. Now you regret it. Chapter 10. After this incident, not only had I rid the company of its parasites, but my name was finally cleared. Once people learned about my relationship with my father, no one believed I was after the little money Eric had. As for Eric, he was busy selling his house and car, borrowing money everywhere he could. I smoothly took over the company, and under my father's guidance, I was already capable of managing things on my own. But today, as I was leaving work, I noticed a child standing next to my car. As I approached, I realized it was Eric's son, Lucas. He stood there, looking at me nervously, puzzled. I asked, "What are you doing here? Where are your parents?" He just shook his head. I took out my phone, intending to call the police, but Lucas tugged on my sleeve and whispered, "I know the way home. Can you take me there?" Though Eric and Selena were despicable, the child was innocent. I had no choice but to drive him to the address he gave me. Sitting quietly in the passenger seat, Lucas didn't say a word. The silence was broken by a faint rumbling sound. "You'll find some cookies in the car." I told him, "Help yourself." He quickly found them, holding one hand under his mouth as he ate carefully, as if afraid of leaving crumbs in my car. After a while, he said, "My mom says you're the wicked witch who ruined our family, but my dad says you're the beautiful angel who fell from the sky." I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. I found it absurd and infuriating that both parents would dump their emotions on this innocent child. Lucas looked at me and asked, "Auntie, can you do me a favor?" "What kind of favor?" I asked in return, but he didn't answer. We drove the rest of the way in silence. Soon, we arrived at the address he gave me. After getting out, I walked him to the door. Just as the door was about to open, Lucas turned to me, his eyes red, and said, "Auntie, I'm sorry." The next second, the door swung open. Before I could react, a cloth was pressed against my mouth and nose. The world around me began to distort, and soon, I lost consciousness. Chapter 11. When I woke up, my hands and feet were bound tightly with rough ropes. In front of me stood Selena and Lucas. Before I could say anything, Lucas's eyes welled up with tears. He cried, "I know I shouldn't have lied to you, Auntie, but I really need my mom's love and attention. Mom only loves Dad. Her eyes are always fixed on him. But Mom said that if I could trick you into coming here, she would love me." Hearing this, I couldn't help but find it ironic. Selena had no time or energy to love her own son. Her entire being was consumed with Eric. Even now, Selena didn't spare her son a glance. Her gaze was entirely on me, perhaps due to the stress of their debts. She looked haggard, her cheeks sunken, her cheekbones protruding. She appeared sharper, more severe. "Laura, do you know what I discovered?" she asked, her voice cold. She tossed an album onto the floor in front of me, flipping through its pages. She spoke softly. "These are all pictures Eric took of you during your college years. He really loved you, didn't he?" I glanced at the album. Page after page contained photos of me from my university days, but all of them were taken without my knowledge. There was a picture of me eating in the cafeteria. Another of me was reading in the library, walking back to the dorm after evening classes. Even one of me was listening to a lecture. Years worth of secret photographs. Did Selena really think this was love? To me, it was nothing but disturbing, so extreme that even seeing it now made my skin crawl. Selena pulled out a lighter and set the album on fire. With a twisted smile, she said, "What dream girl? I'll make all of this disappear right now." The acrid smell of burning paper filled the air, stinging my nose. I turned my face away, irritated. After burning the album, Selena grabbed my chin and forced me to face her. "Isn't it this face of yours that Eric loves so much?" she sneered. "Then I'll destroy it right now." Chapter 12. Just as the fruit knife in Selena's hand got closer and closer to me, I spoke. "Punishing me like this, have you never thought about divorce? Or, while you're so focused on revenge against me, have you thought about taking revenge on him?" Her hand froze midair. She started muttering to herself. Why was I the one who married him? Why was I the one who gave birth to his child and ran this household? Yet the person he loves is you? Were these 10+ years with him all a lie? I locked eyes with her and interrupted. "Selena, stop making one mistake after another. Is he really worth it? Your son is so adorable, but you won't even spare him a glance. The world is beautiful without Eric, but you refuse to see it." Selena stared at me for a long time, her gaze so intense it made my skin crawl. Then she laughed, a near-deranged laugh. "You're so good at pretending to be righteous. You're only saying all this to make me give up on Eric so you can have him for yourself." I replied flatly. "Why would I want a man who's rotten to the core?" Her laughter turned to tears. "I chose to be the strong female lead in a wife-chasing romance. Why didn't it work? Why did Eric become cold to me again just days after chasing me? What went wrong?" I stared at her in shock. It turned out that I wasn't the only one who knew. Selena could see those strange words too. Selena suddenly furrowed her brows, looking puzzled. Could that damn system have lied to me? If not, why didn't I win Eric's love back? Why am I still unhappy? I sighed. Because Eric can't give you happiness. Depending on someone else to provide your happiness is fleeting at best. Only by finding joy and stability within yourself can you truly be happy. I continued. Selena, who says the female lead in a wife-chasing romance is automatically a strong, independent woman? Those stories are nothing but fantasies spun for the male and female leads. The male lead is fickle at first, only to regret it deeply after losing what he took for granted. The entire pursuit is just a self-serving journey of redemption for him. As for the female lead, she usually senses something is wrong early on but refuses to end things. She doesn't stop her losses in time and instead convinces herself she's sacrificed so much. She knowingly gets involved with a man who has feelings for someone else and continues down that path, turning her own pain into a badge of honor while letting the man mistreat her. From my perspective, wife-chasing isn't about two people finding their way back to each other. It's two people indulging in their own self-absorbed monologues. Pathetic and hypocritical. Chapter 13. Selena stared at me blankly. Laura, you don't understand me because you're loved. You have money, and you have Eric's love. That's why you can be so confident. I didn't want to argue further. What Selena saw as love was, in my eyes, nothing more than selfish indulgence with no regard for others. It wasn't worth encouraging, nor was it something I felt grateful for. Selena had clearly gone off the deep end. I couldn't help but wonder what kind of poisonous charm Eric had cast on her. Selena became more agitated as she spoke. her expression twisting into something grotesque. She grabbed anything flammable in the room and set it ablaze. The fire quickly grew out of control. Selena laughed and said, "I'll bury Eric's dream girl here forever." With that, she stormed out of the house, even forgetting Lucas. At that moment, the strange words appeared again. "This heroine is totally deranged, completely unhinged. What kind of strong female lead is this? She's just a love-struck lunatic." By the end, it's clear the only sane person here is the second lead. Wait, why isn't the second lead panicking even though she's about to die? Because I knew the police would arrive soon. The moment Lucas appeared by my car alone, I had already felt suspicious. When we arrived at the destination, and he insisted I walk him to the door, I sensed something was off. Before stepping out of the car, I had sent a text to the police. Looking back, it was the smartest decision I'd made, otherwise I might have died there. Soon enough, the door was kicked open by the police. Both Lucas and I were rescued. Selena was arrested for arson. When she saw me one last time, she was hysterical. "You're alive? How can you still be alive? Why? I'm supposed to be the heroine. How could you be the one who wins?" I replied calmly, "Selena, you keep calling yourself the heroine, but do you even know what it means to be a strong female lead?" Selena fell silent, staring at me blankly, as if waiting for my answer. Unfortunately, I didn't know the answer either. What defines a strong female lead? I had no idea. Is it a woman without love or a man in her life, solely focused on her career? I couldn't agree with that. Different people have different choices and ways of living. Does having love make a woman any less of a strong female lead? Not necessarily. I didn't dwell on the question for long. There were too many things on my plate that required my attention. Later, Eric was imprisoned for failing to repay his debts, and those strange words never appeared again. But one day, a voice suddenly echoed in my ears. It spoke mechanically. "Do you want to become a strong female lead? A heroine in a wife-chasing story, a revenge tale, or maybe a modern or historical drama? You choose." I frowned and shouted, "Get lost! I don't want to be anyone's idea of a strong female lead. That label comes with too many rules and constraints. I refuse. I just want to be myself. I am Laura, and I'll live my life as Laura. That's enough for me."